What up, dudes? Guess what? I'm back making some cool stuff because, I quit doing things that are bad for my brain. So, it's working again. So, this one's about, some cool stuff. And I'm gonna start off with, a nice little video from probably around 2020, 2021. I don't even remember. I don't know. I don't actually know what the video is gonna be yet. But it's probably gonna be some chanting. So, be ready for that. Stolen land and stolen people is a chant you often hear at protests across the Western world. It refers to the indisputable fact that colonial powers conquered foreign lands and engaged in slavery, which took on a racial aspect which was relatively unique in history. I fully agree with the protesters that those acts are unjustifiable by our standards, but I believe they lack a nuanced understanding of the history of these issues. In this video, I'll mostly focus on the stolen land allegations, and I'll make a part 2 that is stolen people. I'm 20 years old, and I've definitely mentioned on this channel before that all my life, almost all of my friends have been leftists, ever since I reached the age where people became somewhat politically aware. So through conversation with them, I've learned what they generally believe and the general education level on the subjects they like to talk about most. Contrary to what conservatives like to believe, they do know that wars of conquest were a fact of life almost everywhere in the world in the 13, 14, 15, 16, and 1700s. But they have this weird, vague impression that Europe was over that kind of behavior in the age of exploration. And this is understandable considering the Holy Roman Empire, which was already a weird confederation type political structure of autonomous states, had been created a few hundred years prior. France had been more or less the same size and shape for hundreds of years, aside from the occasional spat with England. The Reconquista was almost complete, and the idea of a nation state was starting to take shape in the minds of Europeans. Europe as a whole looked a lot like a low-resolution version of modern Europe. I think a lot of this is an illusion constructed by hindsight. Europe was still very much into conquest. As I mentioned before, France and England continually tried to exert control over one another, while England also tried to unite the British Isles under their flag. The Reconquista is often seen as an anti-conquest, as a group of people trying to take back their homeland, and this is a legitimate interpretation, as the name Reconquista suggests, but there is a lot more nuance than that. And that brings us to our first stolen land myth. This technically is not a full-on myth, but it is close enough, and for continuity's sake, I'm going to call it that. Most people's understanding of the Reconquista is very two-dimensional. The Christian Spanish lived in Iberia, the Muslim Umayyad Caliphate conquered them, the Spanish rebelled and slowly reconquered the peninsula from the north, ending in the defeat of Granada in 1492. It is way more convoluted than this. At the beginning of written history, Iberia, or Hispania, was occupied by the Celts in the northwest and the Iberians in the southeast, with a transitional area in the middle. Hispania naturally became a battleground of influence between Rome and Carthage pretty quickly, and became a major theater of war on several occasions, ultimately resulting in its conquer by Rome in 19 BC. As the Western Roman Empire lost control over the peninsula, the Visigoths moved in from the north, mostly uniting Iberia for a second time, just to then be conquered a few hundred years later by the Muslim Umayyad Caliphate from the south in the early... Oh shit, a tree just fell down outside. Damn, dude. They were conquered a few hundred years later by the Muslim Umayyad Caliphate from the south in the early 700s AD, uniting all or most all of the peninsula, depending on the source. So far, the ethnically disunified and diverse peninsula has been conquered by Latins, Germans, and Arab and Berber Muslims, never having been unified under a native regime. As the Muslims moved in, they forced the native Christians to either convert to Islam or be deported northward. Many were killed or enslaved. The Reconquista began in the north shortly after the initial conquest concluded. 3 kingdoms made it up at the beginning, the kingdom that would ultimately become the nations of Basque, Catalonia, as well as the kingdom of Castilla, which merged with Aragon, or Catalonia, to become Spain near the end of the Reconquista. Kingdoms repeatedly split, seceded, and merged throughout this ordeal. That's where you get Galicia, Leon, Asturias, and Portugal. The Reconquista was not one unified effort to beat back the Muslims. In fact, the Christian kingdoms often fought and conquered one another, had occasional spats with France, and allied with various Muslim states that succeeded the Umayyad. The division during this period is why Iberia is so linguistically diverse, with major languages like Portuguese and Spanish, but also the lesser-known languages like Catalan, Basque, Galician, Aragonese, and Leonese. In addition, it wasn't just about taking back lost lands for all kingdoms. Aragon had no problem establishing their own colonies across the Mediterranean in Italy, Sicily, and Greece. Not only was the event not the product of a unified front, it was also carried out by deporting, killing, and converting Muslims by force. Conversions were rare, so most of the population was just replaced with remnant Christian populations from the north. This is the main reason the peninsula has always been so sparsely populated. The Muslims got rid of the natives, then what few natives there still were hiding in the mountains of Asturias got rid of the Muslims. It took more than 700 years to reconquer the peninsula. That is generations upon generations upon generations of Muslims living in the same plots of land. That is longer than the English-speaking people have lived in America. Imagine hordes of Indians hiding in the Yucatan or Alaska, slowly making their way through Mexico, the United States, then Canada, murdering, deporting, and force converting all of us, the people who have lived here for more than 400 years in many cases. Even your most militant leftist would have a hard time justifying that. To be clear, this isn't a moral condemnation of Spain or Portugal. Every nation has an origin story if you go back far enough, and I think the Muslim world and Iberia turned out alright for the most part. This is just to demonstrate that Europe was still barbaric in a lot of ways, and if you didn't notice, the same year the Reconquista came to a close, Columbus, supported by the Spanish government, discovered America, starting a whole new age of conquest for the peninsula, largely fueled by the same mentality of spreading Christianity and keeping the momentum going. So the first myth went over an event that most people, including leftists, view as good or at least neutral. A people conquered and driven abroad just to come back decades or centuries later and take back what was theirs. That brings me to myth 2, which is much more recent, but also ancient, pragmatic, and peaceful, but also a million times more controversial. There are two main perceptions of Israel, that of the left, who identify it as a modern-day settler colony, exercising a more subversive form of apartheid, and that of the right, and many liberals, who view it as a romanticized version of the Reconquista. Both are technically correct, but again, both lack nuance. The halfway mythical origin of the Jews in Israel starts around 1300 BC, with Moses leading the Jews out of Egypt, with Joshua crossing the Jordan River later that century. The Kingdom of David was established around 1000 BC, with Jerusalem as their capital. Eventually, some internal politics and violence created two kingdoms, the kingdoms of Judah and the kingdom of Israel, before they both get smoked by the Assyrians and again by the Babylonians in 722 and 586 BC, resulting in many, most, or all Jews being exiled from their new homeland before returning in 515 BC with the establishment of Judea. In 63 BC, they are conquered by Rome, which leads to a rebellion by the Jews and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and another revolt years later which resulted in the Romans renaming Judea Palestine as an insult to the Jews. During this time, Jews were scattered across Europe, and it is the main reason why there are so many of them outside of Israel these days. In 636, they are conquered by the Arabs, and then from 1099 to 1291, the Crusades are happening. During the days of the Ottoman Empire, Jews began trying to return to Israel, and it gained steam until the British pledged Israel to the Jews in 1917. So some political stuff happens, some massacres of Jews happen as a result of Jewish immigration, some borders shift, some war happens. Eventually the Jews have their own state. The land is partitioned effectively, one part for Jews, the other part for Muslims. Much like post-World War II Berlin, Jerusalem is partitioned like the rest of the country. In the Israeli constitution, Muslims are asked to stay as full equal Israeli citizens. Another war is declared on Israel by all her neighbors, where the West Bank, Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, and Gaza Strip are taken by Israel. They give up everything except for the Golan Heights for military purposes. At the end, the Muslim coalition created against Israel decided no peace, no negotiations, no recognition, which continued until Trump's Abraham Accords in 2020. A lot of war, terrorism, concessions, destruction of Jewish settlements, and other shit happens in the meantime. One of the things that happened during this time is Israel taking all of Jerusalem, which seems to be the main thing that leftists are concerned about. When they took back the other half of Jerusalem, they evicted a lot of Muslims and moved Jews into their homes. The lesser-known part of the story is decades earlier, when the Muslims got their sole control over that half of Jerusalem, they evicted the Jews living there and redistributed their housing. And the more nuanced story of what Israel did when they took it back is they didn't blindly evict Muslims. They gave the option to Jewish families who had been evicted to take back their homes they had been evicted from. And compensation for the Muslim families was lacking, given that many of those properties had legitimately changed hands since Muslim occupation. Israel also fucked up by not offering the same options to Muslim families to take back their homes they had been evicted from in West Jerusalem, giving everyone ammunition to claim Israel is unfair to Muslims. A few things that set Israel apart from Iberia is Jews have always been in Israel, and Israel is now an integrated Jewish-Muslim society. While Iberians were almost entirely pushed out, they took back their land violently, and they treated the Muslims they replaced the same way they had been treated. Both situations are theft, counter-theft, and the morality is gray in many areas of each, but one is clearly more justified and was carried out more peacefully and fairly than the other, yet one is viewed neutrally or positively, and the other is almost universally negatively among leftists. To be fair, the conflicting views of these two situations for most people are mostly due to incomplete information, but even leftist intellectuals educated in history justify the inconsistency by saying that the Israeli conflict is ongoing and the more recent major events are within living memory. But I would say that the only difference between the Jews and the Muslims of the region is that there have been more Jewish immigration and there is more terrorism and belligerence on the Palestinian side, which you can hardly blame all Israelis or Palestinians for. Most people I know, including my conservative family, see South Africa as a land which was conquered by Europeans, enslaved, and settled. A land that has always had a black majority, and a land where a trend of Europeans exploiting and destroying native populations is the dominant one. While there was loads of exploitation and conquest did happen, and some areas were occupied by blacks when Europeans first showed up, like I've been pointing out this whole time, there is loads of nuance that changes the whole picture of South African history. Modern socialist ethno-nationalist parties in South Africa consistently refer to taking back land from whites and returning it to the native black population, but as I'll explain, this is a warped view of history. First, the racial divisions of mankind should be explained. Americans generally think of race as both more and less complex than it actually is. For example, all sub-Saharan Africans are seen as one race, black, while Arabs and Europeans are seen as distinct. In reality, native sub-Saharan Africans fall into three groups: Bantu, the people who we know generally as blacks; Pygmy, who are characterized by their extremely small size and who have been almost completely replaced by the Bantu in their homeland of the Congo and have almost all of their native culture lost; and the Khoisan, who have been genocided by the Bantu almost everywhere except the Kalahari, while they used to occupy almost everything below the equator. All of these races have dark skin, but are as distinct as Chinese are from Swedes, or even as the Swedes are from the Bantu themselves. The African continent has more genetic diversity than the rest of the world combined, so it shouldn't be too surprising that this is the case. The Dutch East India Company initially purchased the Cape Colony from the local Khoisan in 1671, who at the time still occupied all of South Africa except for the far eastern coast. The Cape was initially an outpost for Dutch trade, but eventually VOC retirees began farming on the Cape and became known as the Boers. They began wandering off the colonial lands to escape Dutch administration and later British rule, along with French and German refugees as well as some Khoisan and mixed-race people. Some Boers did own slaves, and one reason for leaving the Cape later on was resentment of the British for confiscating their slaves without compensation. By the time of the Great Trek, the genocide of the Khoisan had accelerated rapidly due to the Bantu adoption of Portuguese weaponry and drill, and as the Boers moved northeast, they were walking through and claiming almost entirely depopulated vacant land. For the first several years when they did come across Bantu tribes, often those very same tribes that killed the native inhabitants, they would purchase land from them, trading favors or cattle. Multiple tricks and massacres and backstabbings perpetrated by the various Bantu groups soured the Boers' view of cooperation with them, and they began approaching them with more skepticism and hostility, eventually resulting in actual conquest in some instances. The Boers established multiple independent states from the British, but they were always ultimately brought under British control. In many areas of South Africa, the Boers are more native than the black population, claiming to be native. Most of the land taken by the Boers themselves was fairly purchased or was vacant land whose native population had been exterminated by the Bantu. A more fair and accurate view of South African history would be Europeans established settlements in the west by purchasing land, while the Bantu established settlements in the east through genocide and conquest. And both groups moved towards the middle, one purchasing land or settling on already vacated land, and the other genociding both lands they want for themselves and lands they have no intention of settling. Eventually they meet, and some good faith interaction takes place, but the genocidal side breaks treaties, trade agreements, and other contracts and murders innocent women and children, resulting in the formerly peaceful side turning to conquest. The native population of South Africa is gone, so unless you think that when there is no clear air, property should go to whoever has the closest skin color regardless of actual personal connection or anything else, white South Africans have just as much right to South Africa as black South Africans do. There is a movement here in the U.S. that on the outside seems to be nearly as large as the movement to return land to the natives, and that is a movement to give the land Mexico lost in the Mexican-American War, plus Texas, back to Mexico. The Mexican-American War was caused by a territorial dispute in Texas. Long story short, Spain encouraged Americans to move into the region now known as Texas before Texan independence. Before the trip was fully organized, Mexico gained independence, and the future Texans negotiated with Mexico for the ability to settle in Texas. They managed to get the plan back on track and settled Texas with no problem. Some political issues ensued, Texas wanting to be treated like other states in Mexico, but the Mexican government refusing statehood due to cultural differences. Texans, tired of being treated like second-class citizens, attempted negotiations with the new president, Santa Anna. They didn't work. Santa Anna became a dictator, tried to disarm the Texans to prevent a rebellion, instead sparking one. Texans won with the capture of Santa Anna and the signing of the Velasco Treaty, establishing the Rio Grande as the border between the Republic of Texas and Mexico. Mexico refused to acknowledge the treaty given that Santa Anna was forced to sign while captured, and insisted the border was actually the Nueces River, which was much further north. Texas unsuccessfully tried to enforce their border during the 10 or so years we were independent before annexation by the U.S. The U.S. with more resources enforced the border, being the Rio Grande River, and shots were exchanged by Mexican and American troops, both seeing the presence of the other as an invasion of their sovereign land. The U.S. won the war that ensued and took most of the western United States as a reward, purchasing some extra in the South for a planned future railroad. This whole ordeal is the equivalent to a school bully trying to take your lunch money, using intimidation. You fight back, win, mutually decide he will leave you alone from then on while he's in a headlock. Then he decides to keep bothering you. A bigger kid becomes your friend, and next time the bully messes with you, the kid beats him up and takes his whole wallet. Then the bully claims he was robbed. Technically, he was, and maybe the punishment didn't fit the crime. But he did agree not to mess with the kid anymore last time and went back on that promise. So a lot of people would say he got what was coming to him. Mexico was a bully who took advantage of a smaller country, and then America was an even bigger bully who used the actions of Mexico as moral justification for her bullying. Neither are correct, but saying that one is more morally righteous than the other just because she lost is wrong. Losing doesn't make you more moral, it just makes you a loser. Winning doesn't make you more moral, it just makes you a winner. I understand the give the land back to Mexico argument for the western states, but Texas in its entirety, according to the Valesco Treaty, should be solidly in Texas or U.S. hands. You again run into the issue confronted by the Reconquista and Jerusalem. It's been over 150 years since the Mexican-American War, and generations of Americans have lived and died in western states in that time. Property has changed hands legitimately countless times. The people living there now didn't steal the land they live on, just like the Muslims in Spain in the 1400s hadn't stolen any land from the Spaniards, just like the Muslims who purchased housing from other Muslims in East Jerusalem never stole any land from Jews. This doesn't even consider the fact that Mexico had inherited that land from Spain, who had taken it by force from the Native Americans. A subset of the Iroquois were a warlike people even before European contact. We know this because of oral traditions passed down by neighboring tribes that had been displaced by them. They lived in East Canada initially, but quickly expanded to occupy the entire Great Lakes region through genocide. Many Indians of the time in the St. Lawrence River valleys gained firearms through the French, who traded them for furs. This gun trade enabled Indian tribes to wipe larger tribes off the map insanely easily, and they took advantage of this power imbalance. They say 90 to 99% of pre-contact Native American populations died due to disease, but a likely substantial and unknown portion of Indians died due to local genocidal conquest perpetrated by other freshly armed Indian tribes, and this was especially true in the Great Lakes region. Versions of this story repeated across what is now the United States and Canada, luckily slowly becoming less devastating as guns proliferated and became more ubiquitous among Indian tribes. By the French and Indian War, fewer tribes in the northern contested territory west of the Appalachians were truly native. And by the time western expansion reached the Great Plains, the story was the same. Many, if not most, of the Indian tribes who fell victim to the Trail of Tears were occupying territory orders of magnitude larger than before British colonization. Same goes for all Indian tribes of Canada. The Indian world pre-contact was one ruled by constant conquest. One tribe would take over another's land, and that tribe would, with nowhere else to go, would target a smaller tribe and do the same to them. The introduction of guns amplified the rate of conquest, the death toll, and the overall carnage. The idea of the noble savage is a myth. The natives were more barbaric than most of the Europeans. I say more barbaric because most Europeans had to learn restraint due to the sheer killing capability of their weaponry, with the notable exception of the Spanish in South America. The savagery of the natives in comparison to the European invaders is irrelevant when it comes to the idea of theft. The Europeans and later Americans often purchased land from the natives, which natives did not do with one another. But the Europeans, and the Americans in particular, also broke treaties for the sake of conquest and tricked natives into doing things that went against their own interests, which forced some tribes to civilize fairly quickly and begin cooperating on scales never seen before in the Americas. The Americans and Europeans operated without honor when it came to the natives, treating them like obstacles and pawns. The lack of honor in the native population doesn't justify a lack of honor on the other side. Two wrongs don't make a right, and the Americans particularly just handed the natives the perceived moral high ground by virtue of being the victims. That aside, who are the natives of North America? We can't say that anyone has the moral high ground, so you can't justify the European conquest of native land the same way you could justify the American conquest of northern Mexico. I'd propose looking back in a chain of ownership of each piece of land. We can take any city as an example, but a well-documented one is Toronto. The so-called neutral nations were an Iroquois group living in and all around the region where Toronto is located when the area was first investigated by the French. They were fairly warlike, but less so than the more eastern Iroquois, who massacred and replaced them in 1651. The neutrals no longer exist, but before the French, they replaced another group, the Huron-Wendat. And being warlike and agrarian as they were, they almost definitely took their land from someone else, potentially a hunter-gathering tribe who occupied that space before them. The Iroquois invaders weren't homogeneous either. The Seneca had been there, and the Mississaugas tribe, who sold the land after the British defeated them in 1793. So how do we find the tribe the Huron-Wendat likely replaced? How do we know that they didn't take that land from someone else? If we can't find such a tribe, would it be right to give that land back to the Iroquois who genocided them to begin with? In that situation, the British are the only ones who actually paid for the land, even if it was after winning a war against them. So even though that is a less than legitimate purchase, it is more legitimate than outright genocide and conquest. So is that the ownership that we should respect, especially since the modern owners have been trading the land legitimately for over 200 years now? Europe is full of population replacement events, so there is a lot of stolen land there, some on really large scales, like the Syrian, Zagros, and Egyptian races who mixed in the Fertile Crescent and Neolithic times, genocided the Ice Age Black European inhabitants, and replaced them. These are the people who built Stonehenge and are likely the creators of the Basque and Uralic languages. After that, the Indo-Europeans came from Russia, genocided Northern Europe, while just culturally replacing the Southern Europeans, creating a genetic gradient of nearly 99% Indo-European in Britain to nearly 99% Middle Eastern farmer in Sardinia. Smaller scale situations happened as well, like the Germanic groups of Saxons, Angles, and Jutes killing nearly all of the men in England and taking their land, livestock, and wives, or the Slavs and Huns genociding the more native Germans of Ukraine all the way to the Baltic states, west all the way down to Germany, or the Germans genociding the Celts of Central Europe all the way to southern Ukraine, south to Bulgaria, and further west to the highlands of Turkey, or the Slavs replacing the ethnically Greek Illyrians with the Huns or the Balkans, or the Turks replacing the Greeks in Turkey or northern Cyprus more recently. The Romans killed 2/3 of Gaul, modern-day France, and moved in a lot of Latins and Greeks, and the depopulated state of Gaul made it easy for the Germans in the east to move in and fill in the gaps after the fall of the empire. Should all of these acts be undone? If some are to be and others aren't, which ones and for what reasons? Should we just draw a line at a certain date? Maybe draw the line at living memory? That last one would result in most of Poland being given back to Germany. When people chant land back and reparations here in America, they act like it's easy and simple. An easy hole to poke is in reparations. How do you ascribe a value to the land an Indian tribe has lost in the past? Do you include the land they lost through treaty? Do you deduct the monetary value of resources afforded to them through welfare or even trade for that land in the first place? What value of the land do we pay them with? The modern value or the historic value? Should there be compensation for trauma And if so, what trauma? The trauma they experience because of the reservation system, or the historic real trauma their ancestors felt? Do we deduct money based on the trauma their ancestors caused for other people? How do we quantify modern trauma? Some tribes afford tribal membership based on any lineage traced back. Some require more than 50% ancestry. Those which are more exclusive have very, very wealthy tribal members due to having fewer people to divide tribal profit among. So should choices to be more inclusive disqualify some tribes from some trauma compensation just because to some extent it's self-inflicted? The land back chant is quite popular, but I don't think it is a very popular sentiment in reality. I'll still address it to be thorough. What land should be given back? All of the U.S. or just lands whose historic tribal owners still exist in some form somewhere? What do we do with the people already living there? Most of us are pretty mixed at this point. We don't have a homeland to go back to. I'm like 30% German and 70% Irish, according to my math I did using my parents' numbers that they got from their stupid DNA tests. Where do I go? Ireland or Germany? I don't speak Irish, and I don't speak German. I know that the Irish speak English, but I'm still not Irish. I'm American. I'm Texan, to be specific. I wouldn't fit in most other parts of my own country. What do we do with African Americans? About a quarter of their genome is European, and the rest is divided between West Africa and the Congo. Do we send them back to the Congo, West Africa, or somewhere in Europe? I don't know any pure-blooded anything here in America, unless they are first or second generation immigrants, which most of us aren't. We love racial mixing here in the United States, so the only real homeland any of us have is here. We can't give the land back without creating hundreds of millions of stateless people. We can't give reparations in any organized way because there is no way to juggle the variables or justify giving some groups more than others just based off some made better choices than others. But we also can't give them all the same because some people have had 300 years of oppression while others have had mostly hands-off treatment. I would support a system like Israel's where we're happy about it if Indians want to voluntarily come back to their homeland and coexist with the modern population. What up, players? Thank you for listening and watching. It was, I think this is my most fun video I've made so far. Probably the best one so far as well, especially like actual, the content of the video kind of wise, the information and all that stuff. I'm going to make a footnotes video with all the stories that I couldn't figure out how to fit into this one, and I'm going to make a second video that is going to be about stolen people, which is pretty fun. I've been reading a lot of books, mostly listening to them while I've been at work, about that topic, so I'm excited to make that one. Yeah, so thank you, I guess, yeah.